to an artist talk by Cameron Clayborn in conjunction with the exhibition Soft Allergy. It's currently on view at the Glass Curtain Gallery. My name is Meg Dugood, and I am the Executive Director of the Department of Exhibition, Performing, and Student Spaces. I also have the wonderful pleasure of being the curator for this exhibition. Soft Allergy is born out of the collaboration of individual practices. In a series of call and response installations where edges are present yet hard to determine, the artists in this show have pushed and pulled, upending and uplifting each other's practices. Meeting every few weeks over Zoom since 2020, the artists developed the show virtually by trading material and works in the mail along with toiling in their studios. The works in the show exude formal material and conceptual struggles of their co-creation. They are generative and intuitive. And so the show, in a sense, is always being in a state of being created. I'm going to go through a few images from the show and then introduce Cameron, who will talk for a little bit, and then you can ask questions via chat or by unmuting yourself at the end of the program. So, pardon me. Also, it's like I've shared my screen 1,000 times during the pandemic, yet every time it never feels as seamless as it could. So I'm really going to go through the images, and they're kind of in order of how you would view the works in the gallery. And now I'm going to introduce Cameron. Cameron Clayborn was born in 1992 and was raised in Memphis, Tennessee. He lives and works in New Haven, Connecticut. Clayborn's practice addresses the relationship vulnerability has to power. Their work is materially rooted and combines elements of post-minimalism, craft, performance, and spirituality. He is exhibited nationally and internationally with solo exhibitions and in venues, including Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, that's forthcoming, Art Basel Statements with Simone Sebald Gallery in Basel, Switzerland, where Clayborn was awarded the Beloit Art Prize. Cameron, you might have to enter.
Yeah, Balwas. It doesn't really matter. You say it.
Very, very awesome art prize.
Yeah.
And in Boyfriends in Chicago, among many, many other places. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Cameron.
Hold on, I'm going to share my screen. Thank you so much, Meg, for that introduction. Let's see, how do I? So nice to be here. Okay. So we're all good. You can see these things. These are good things. Okay. I kind of wanted to start off with, with something I've been like thinking about, which I'm kind of going into this moment where I think any practice has this moment where you start to reflect on why you actually do the things that you do and where it's actually coming from. And when you're doing that process, typically you go seeking other people's words for that. And I feel like the words that have been bringing the most true, or at least the closest to how it is I actually feel, are words that are actually coming from Louise Bourgeois. And in it, she says that the intensity of the emotions that she has are too much and that they're too hard to handle. That is why she transfers the energy of her emotions into sculpture. It has nothing to do with the craft. It has nothing to do with how to manage materials. The materials are not the subject of the artist. The subject of the artist is emotions and ideas, or both. And so for me, I am definitely a more emotionally driven artist. I don't think that I'm somebody who's really necessarily driven by an idea. It's usually coming from a source of actual autobiography content or something of the sort. Uh, and so with that, I'm showing you an image of my, like, Google image, Google Earth image of my grandma's house, which was built in the 1950s, I would say, in Malvern, Arkansas. And so this is the house that my father grew up in, and also just became kind of the site of Malvern, Arkansas, of like Black Malvern, Arkansas. And my grandfather worked at a brickyard. So they actually designed the house along with my grandfather on my mom's side. So this is kind of a hodgepodge house that they created on their own. And so, like, one of the parts that I love the most about it is this brick work that is on the side of the car porch. And it's very latticey and very crosshatchy, which you'll start to see come through in the work that I do later in my drawings, which is not something that I would say is like immediately direct. It's not the only reference, but it is something that I always think about. I mean, my grandma's house for me became kind of like a mothership, I would have to say, just because when my parents split when I was a young child, I sort of was rendered placeless. And so, not literally, I ended up living with my father, but I would often go to my grandma's house as almost like a neutral zone, or almost as this space where I could just really explore and expand on my own accord. And she really fostered a lot of that energy for me. Like, there was never a moment where she was like, that's too femme or something, or you couldn't do that. It was very much like she wanted to foster that energy for me. So yeah, I see it as like a mothership. You know, I see it as this place that still hosts and a site of something, and and harnesses energy. One thing I found also really curious about the house too is that when my grandma she passed away in 2012, when she was slowly kind of deteriorating, the house also deteriorated along with her. So the hydrangeas that used to be grown were no longer there. The bushes also withered and went away. And so the house to me has now become kind of a dormant site that we can always go to as a family, but it sort of still rests there with all this energy inside of it. So I'm showing, this is my take on an artist statement. I'm not really one for very clinical and direct and, you know, this is this and this type statements about my work. So I feel like this one is a little bit more accurate as to how what is actually happening within my practice. It is a diagram of a house, for like a schematic, architecture schematic of a house. And in it, I have like put each part of the practice into the house. So drawing and painting is something that I feel like I do in the living room. It's more passerby, more like easy flowing. Video is something that I keep into the bedroom. It's very private. Writing is something that I will never share, so it's inside the bathroom. Performance is something that moves about the hallway, because it's all about movement. And then sculpture for me is really where I get down to the nitty gritty and starting with almost what could be considered ingredients and then creating something out of that. So this is the first piece I would say I've ever made that would be considered my most mature work, or work that I felt like was the closest to the feelings that I had. So this is titled Tool Holder, which there's no necessarily like a numeric order of them. They're just namesake to tool holder. And what you're looking at is glitter vinyl held by steel edges, and inside is upholstery nails, and hanging at the bottom of the form is aluminum donuts that I had casted and polished to a mirror finish. And the way that I even came about this piece was through a very, very tough critique that I had when I was in in the final year of my undergrad, where the teacher came in and she was just like, okay, so this isn't happening. This isn't working. And I was like, what do you mean? So I had to pretty much scrap everything and start from ground zero for the sort of final crit. And so the one thing I ended up doing was going to Textile Discount Outlet in Chicago, which is just one of my favorite places, and I think favorite places for many artists there. And I just walked around waiting for something, walking around waiting for something, waiting to see a material that I felt drawn to. And so once I actually came across the glitter vinyl, it wasn't so much the slickness of the vinyl. It wasn't even so much of the glitter. It wasn't even so much of like the ostentatiousness of the material itself. It was more the fact that I remember it, and I remember it being inside the gay clubs and queer clubs that I went to in Memphis, Tennessee, which there were very few far in between. But when I was 18, I was like, sneaking into those places. And that was one of the very few places that I ever felt like, oh, okay, so there are zones, there are spaces and places that could allow me to be something else or see other people that I also knew existed but hadn't seen in real life. And so that is the reason why I sort of chose the material. And then after that, I was just like, okay, so I don't really want to do much to it. I don't want to over manipulate it. I kind of want to rest in what it is and let it do its own storytelling. So instead of like manipulating it, I just found a way, almost in a Robert Morris looking way, just allow it to hang on its own weight, and then using the aluminum donuts, which are very alluring and very like seductive, and allow them to kind of rest inside this very yonic shape. And so the thing is that sexuality or gender or things like that come into my work, for me, isn't coming from a space that's like purely sexual or like pornographic, as like Audre Lorde would say, or something like that. It's more from the erotic, which is what Audre Lorde is positing, which is the idea that you could actually get inside of a material and be enticed by it, be enthralled by it in a way that is not as flat as the sexual, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. I just think that there's something to the erotic, something to material that allows you to like get more inside yourself and get closer to yourself. And so here's just like a few more of them. And like the object in the center that allows the weight and the shape of the form to take, it can vary. So sometimes it'll be like aluminum donuts, or if it was often like steel that I had laying around in the studio that I would then kind of carve out and then round the edges of the bar, and then let that hang inside of the form. And then once I had been working with those tool holder forms for a minute there, I was also positioned to rethink them by that same said teacher. And she's like, okay, so you're making things on the wall. That's great. Now get off. And then I was like, oh, okay. Like what would it look like if this part, these ideas were to translate themselves away from sort of the two-dimensional, quasi two-dimensional into the three-dimensional, which for me, that meant that there had to be a material shift. Like that meant that something had to be different, because I feel like sculpture works a little bit differently than the two-dimensional. Those, sculpture's like literally in front of you, and like you could literally bump up against it. It's pushing so much energy on you. So once I did that, I went back to the fabric store and then located one that felt almost more like flesh, like my flesh. And I started creating these bags without any sort of measurement to them, without any sort of real pattern. I just cut out the shapes, which usually turned out to be more rectangular, and then by filling them up with sand, they became these really hard, stiffened, and just very in like in your way type forms. And they're not very easy to move because they're so heavy. And so when I was working with them, I also didn't really care to like isolate the forms. And so I ended up putting a lot of them together and then forming what I would call a coagulate. And then so also uh, each singular piece within the coagulate is known as a cushion container bag. So I already started like building and playing with language as a means to like, you know, build my own ideas or build like a sort of language for my own self to figure out how I think about these objects. And so this is at a show, this is like my first solo show at Boyfriends in Chicago that was titled Body. And then in it, like past this point, the objects just, I didn't want them to rest completely as sculpture. And also when I had graduated from SCIC, I went into a very, I really, I mean, I love SCIC, you know, like, hey, I had my education, but I did feel like I didn't quite get enough Black history, Black art history, and understanding what someone who looks like me may have made 200 years before me, you know, so I had to sort of locate that history for myself. And then in the process of doing that, it's like, you know, by looking at that Brancusi that I was looking at, it was like, oh, actually, like, move out of the way. And then you start to see the thing that Brancusi was inspired by, which is these African forms, these forms that we actually don't even really have an artist to lay to them, because that's not the point of them. They're like more spiritual objects. They function in a very, very different way than in the Western way of treatment of art. And so when I saw like pieces like that, and then started going to the AIC Art Institute and going into the African wing, and then sort of seeing, you know, these spiritual objects, especially like Nkiti Nkundi and things like that, which, you know, those objects are, if you are thinking of them in their way that they are being presented to you, they are harnessing energy. Like they literally have energy rested inside of them and been transferred into them, you know. And so, like, as I said before, as Bourgeois has said, you know, emotion is literally transference into the sculpture. So that very idea is something that I was like, oh, this is not uncommon for me to feel this way about sculpture. This is something that it could happen, where you could transfer energy into a form and externalize it. And so once I had done that, I started thinking about how I could actually use the forms, like what could I do with them? And I ended up bringing in one of my friends, Courtney Mankindans, who's a choreographer, and she helped me like figure out how to use the forms. Hold on. Ooh, there it goes. And I ended up creating this performance called Bodybuilder #1, where I'd kind of rather just like show it and then I'll talk to you about it.
And begin. Titillation can be described and depicted in many forms. Open legs, bent toes, raised buttocks, raised buttocks, raised buttocks. I repeat, open legs, bent toes, raised buttocks, raised buttocks, raised buttocks. In thinking about titillation of the muscles, I am reminded a story involving a brown 16-year-old male. They liked to run, running at 5 a.m. in the morning in a gated apartment complex. Soon after, they were told by their parents, "You cannot run at 5 a.m. in the morning in a gated apartment complex. A brown 16-year-old male cannot run at 5 a.m. in the morning in a gated apartment complex.
So I'll pause it there. So bodybuilder number one, which, you know, as you make a work and then you come back and look at it later, you start to see it very differently. And so in this piece, I mean, the choreography is coming from an, like, you know, what is seemingly an omniscient narrator, you know, and it's got a very low, deep, guttural voice, and they know information about me. They know my story or know parts of things that have happened to me and are telling this thing to the public audience that would be present as the performance goes on. And you know, the more I think about it, I feel that that voice is probably my father, because that voice is so commanding, and in the process of it, it's telling me how to love myself and how to like pretty much like how to be Black and exist in the world. Because a lot of the time it's describing things like, oh, okay, so a brown 16-year-old man could not go running at 5 a.m. in the morning in a gated apartment complex. They need to know how to love yourself. And so my father is a very athletic person, and growing up, as means to really gain any sort of intimacy towards him, I would often, you know, do sports. You know, I did track for like so many years and also played football. So these kinds of things, like this sort of muscle memory or training, is something that I've always kind of understood and has been part of my life for, you know, for all of my life. And so it makes sense that I would have done a performance that was so physically exhausting, and then also one that was like pretty labor intensive, as you know, because as I'm getting to train to go out into the world, I need to train not only my physical body but my spiritual body, and all this information is being told to me. And so that after that performance, I started thinking more about the cushion container bags and what was their capability, like how could I reimagine them. And one of the things that I was wanting to work more with was like the non-specificity in their measurement. And so I wanted to work with a way for there to be something specific about them. And once I started doing that, I was like, okay, well, then the most easiest thing to default on would be my own body. And so I started making patterns out of my leg measurements and out of my arm measurements, and then started creating forms out of that. So so what you're looking at is 2 cushion container bags, which are my left and right leg. Which, I mean, in this very idea, like seeing that externalized, I can't help but still think that it still has the same life force or some kind of energy inside of the bags themselves. And so I started stretching that out past my own body and then going into other people that I know and other people that are surrounding me, specifically my father. And I got his measurements, or actually, I think I asked and he never gave them to me. So then I approximated. I actually ended up approximating what his size would be in accordance to my own body. And I ended up creating his legs, and then also his torso. I created like pretty much every single part of his body. And then that in turn, also like other objects I had also been creating too, and then making outfits and taking photos with these objects and with outfits, just almost like as archival material, but also as a means to know how these objects make me feel, as to what it feels like to be inside this, not even necessarily a costume, but to be inside something so different from myself. I mean, I would have to say that every single work I've probably ever made has been nothing but an attempt to get closer to who I think I might be, you know, or closer to another aspect of myself, you know, another way to explore parts of me. And so in these photos, I feel like that's what you're pretty much saying. So this is like self-portrait with a cushion container bag, self-portrait with drawer, speaker mat holder. And so I ended up doing a performance with all these forms and like kind of an installation, which I also titled Bodybuilder Performance Number 2. And that ended up involving using the sort of body parts of myself and my father. And then at the same time, I was learning how to Vogue. And I ended up using the space as a practice space that I could come to like anytime I wanted, and practicing how to Vogue, but with my dad's body and my body. And so here's like sort of images of that. And I mean, I wanted to install it directly in front of the windows. So that way there would be like a interaction with people that are on the outside. So there's always this sort of thing of like private space being opened, which actually after doing this performance, I kind of stopped performing for a little minute there, because I was honestly kind of confused by it. Because it was one of these moments where people, where I was actually kind of more confused as to how, what was a private space? Like, what was I doing this for? Who was I doing this for? You know, was it a spectacle, or was it something as an actual exercise? So then it ended up, you know, making me really rethink how I felt about performance and what my relationship to it was. So I had to kind of put it on the back burner for a little bit. And then after doing that, I kind of just fell into drawing, which drawing is it's just like such a necessary tool for me, or became such a necessary tool after performances and making sculpture, where I could work in an immediate way. And so in order to actually gain a kind of language in the 2D, I got this like red notebook, and I would just draw in it constantly and make sure that I would like when I would draw, I would make sure that I wouldn't overthink anything that I was doing. And so in the, like, you can kind of see on the dates, I would date it just to make sure like that I was keeping to a sort of schedule about it. And I would just draw all the time, and I didn't care about what it would look like or how it might be, as long as I wasn't overthinking it. And so the forms could sometimes take on what could be ideas for a sculpture, but then most of the time it was just mainly just weirdness. I just wanted to lean more towards the weird, more towards things that I couldn't give language to, just because I felt like the cushion container bags kind of became something so logical, and I didn't want to rely on logic anymore. And so in an attempt, I actually try to externalize a drawing, and that is what led me into making these kinds of forms. And it's like such a weird process, because it was the first time where I wasn't overthinking it. I was just like, okay, so I have some paper lying around in the studio, and I started experimenting with it, and then using this popcorn ceiling paint texture, applying it. I was like, okay, wow, that hardens. So it hardens. Now what? You know, now I can actually like build something out of that form. And then I ended up lining the back half of the form with what would this be called? This is gosh, losing words. Pink insulation that like goes inside of the house, like kind of like the meat of the home. And so there's like very much like an interior exterior moment that's happening, and it's also casting this like pink shadow. It was like one of the more pieces that I felt like I had tapped into something. I don't know what it is I had tapped into, but it was something very different than the logic that I was working from. And also in this, like, I was still kind of relying on the body though as means to give form. So in this way, it's in the position of a prayer pose. And then also working more with the cushion container bags, but also again, like not overthinking it and not trying to create any particular kind of image. So this is just like a sort of beige and brown form. and some of these kind of flesh tubey ones that are like relying on it. And then in that process, I actually ended up creating a form that I called room piercers. And so they actually came from another piece kind of like a year prior, where there was like this steel sharpened edge that was jutted out against the audience coming out of a frame. And one of the more successful parts of that, I thought, was that piercing part, or was that sharp point. And so I was like, I'm just going to zero in on that. And you know, as I mentioned, I was looking at like Nikitsi Nikundi and African spiritual sculptures. And one of the main things about a Nikitsi Nikundi is that in order to access the power of that object, you have to drab a nail or a sharp object into it as means to access the power. And so I sort of started taking from that technology, taking from that way of working, and creating something for myself as means to access the power of the room that it's installed in, which I ended up calling room piercers. And sometimes they could be what I would say is like me abstracted into a form, Jean and Brown, or they could be pretty reduced and in just all steel and polished. And the object that I would put on there, I would just call it room piercer with tool, leaving it ambiguous as to what exactly that means, like what it could be, what the tool could be, what it could be used for. It's knowledge that I'm not giving up. So yeah, I would just play around using many different types of forms, textures. And so this is when I started getting more and more into my drawings and just really diving deep. And so this is when I started going more into abstraction, like abstract language, to which, like, I mean, I love abstraction. It's just one of the most clear ways, I think, of expressing, especially an emotion, without trying to get too close to it. Because that's the thing. I don't think that I'm seeking to name or seeking to solve anything. It's more of an open-ended question when it comes to abstraction. So except for the elements, I think are pretty like specific. There's usually cross-hatching and these very weird orbital forms, which are coming from my fingerprint being kind of rubbed out. And I've always sort of saw the red dot in the center as a means of like a prick, in which you usually do to find DNA. Oh yes, so sorry, the titles. Spinning on the inside. I think this one's titled If and When It Expands. And Puddle with Promise. And diving more into them. And then when I'm working on these, I really am not overthinking it. It's like so much about joy. And it's so much about going to the paper and not trying to do anything, or it's just doing, you know, like I don't want to overthink. I don't want to try. I simply want to just externalize and let it be what it is. And so then once I started, you know, gathering a real language for it, then I can expand it into kind of any sort of shape or size. And this, I think, is titled Morphing. These are a little bit larger, more like 53 by 53. The other ones were like 24 by 24. And then going back into the cushion container bags, but then almost in the same sort of energy as the drawings were giving me, which was to not overthink the form, not overthink the shape, not overthink it. And actually thinking more of them as actual encapsulations of energy, you know. So to me, cushion container capsules, as I called them, which is like a, you know, a weird remorphing of the idea, is where I can, you know, they just are transference of energy, and I can adorn them in any sort of way, in this very floral, celebratory way. And there's also a lot of humor too, because I don't like to take myself too seriously. I think it's important to not. And then I started also diving more into the drawings, and then out kind of came these, which I titled A Mother. And sort of, there's always like a central figure, which is host to many different other figures coming off of it, which is how I feel about my mother. Very fluid, very open, very airy, boundless. And so, of course, after I had made a mother series, I was like, okay, I have to make a father, or like, what would a father look like? And so in doing that, I was kind of at home and then just sketching out random ideas, and then out popped this one. And then once I sort of, graduated up into a larger size, it became this. And so this is like cross hatching built up inside of a form. And on the sides, you can kind of still see a vague bit of like a line there, sort of boxed in. And it's all, these pieces, I see a lot of love in them. I see a lot of the relationship that probably could describe the one I have with my father, which is a lot more complex, right? It's not simple. It's not simple. It's not one-sided. It's actually really hard to say. So I see him as both contained, but I also see him as both expansive, which in the very way that I'm doing this, right? It's not only thinking of him, it's thinking of myself, thinking of other parts of myself that perhaps are expanding, but within the boundaries that it can expand in. So then they became larger. A father exposed to light, as I called it. And I've always seen like the edges that are sort of starting to brown as, looking at it as a more of an organism that is probably either going through a process, either, it's changing color. More drawings. And these ones I actually see sort of as like a hodgepodge between the mother and the father, which would be ultimately me, right? And so in that process, I sort of returned to that form that you had saw earlier with the pink and the brown. And so, I mean, I just recently graduated from school, from Yale, and in that process, I was really able to put those forms under scrutiny, which was good because it actually allowed me to rethink them in a way where I know I didn't want them to be related to my skin anymore, and I didn't want them to be related to a sort of violent ripping or sharing of my own organs or my own skin. Whereas now, actually, the only way that I actually came across the denim insulation, which is what the material is that you're seeing, is from a friend who just came by and was like, "Oh, have you seen this material? This was inside of my walls. Do you want to use it?" And I was like, "Okay, I guess." And then I just like let it sit there in the corner. And then after a while, I was like, "Okay, I think I'm gonna actually try and see this through, see what it would look like." And then once I sort of started to step into the blue, that's when I started to step into something that was so much larger than myself, where I started to actually started to imagine that these forms were my body expanded, or somebody's the vegetation of another planet, the anatomy of another planet, which gets into more like Afrofuturist ideologies of imagining myself in the future, imagining myself larger than the constraints that I might think of myself today in this very moment. So it comes from a lot of different places, but I mean, they're titled Homegrown, and yeah, I've been making them for a while now, and they're really fun. I don't want to overthink them either. That's the thing. I still don't even want to overthink these. I don't even want to give them too much language because I don't think it's necessary. I think one thing I did write about them today was that They come off as creatures, abstract creatures. They aren't denoting an exact location or a place of origin. They are essentially placeless, like me. And so, I mean, like, even in the way that they hang within the space, sort of by these like 2 points, it's in order for them to actually stand up straight. To me, gets more into that placeless idea, because they seem like they're probably from another planet or some other location that actually is what they're from. And so this is the only way in which we can display them or show them. And these are quite big, like up to like human scale, tower over you. And there's hair beads that are sort of exuding out of them. And in the process of creating those homegrowns, I was also rethinking how the tool holders were. And I started working with clay and like air baking clay, so you can just bake it into the oven, which I love. And so I've just been having like a bunch of this clay around in the house, and I literally just sit around at night just like making different forms. And I'll make about, I don't know, 100 or so. I mean, I haven't made that many, but I want to get to 100. And in that process, it's like it allows you to, just kind of quick thinking, almost like drawing, where I don't have to overthink what the form could be. And so in the end, I've still put the piercer as a means to display the object, but in the way that it becomes a tool again, it's now more of like an emotional tool, as I call it. To which, like, as an emotional tool, like who the hell knows what that looks like? Like an emotional tool could literally take the form of any kind of thing that you can imagine it to. So like in this way, it's like it hangs, it's got lobes, it's kind of bodily, but not necessarily. And in the process of doing that, I almost wanted to give them a sort of microscopic or weird texture where you could imagine that they look like they're a little bit of alive on the surface, or that they're made up of many different parts. And I think that's the last slide I got. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Oh, beautiful, Kim. Thank you. I just wrote in the chat, and pierced, so their emotional energy is released into the atmosphere.
Yeah, legit.
Baked
Definitely.
in the oven, like your drawing of the kitchen too.
Mm-hmm. No, legit. Yeah.
Master chef.
Does anyone have any questions?
First of all, the work just blows me away. So that's part one. It was just fantastic to see the trajectory and to hear you talk about it. It's probably the most I've heard you talk about your work. And I'm reluctant, but I'll do it anyway, to argue with someone at their own artist talk. But you know me. You talk about not wanting to name anything specifically, and you don't, and I don't think you should, but the work is so extraordinarily layered, and all your references that you just sort of tossed out and then said, I don't want to name it, they're all there. I mean, there is much about a life energy as they are about coffins and death and erotics. And I mean, it's all there. And I do think the fact that you don't want to name it so specifically ends up making it larger still. But just, I think there's a seriousness, a real seriousness, as well as a humor embedded in almost all of them.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I was just gonna tell Judith, I think there can be a unspecific specificity. And I think that's where you hit.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I don't think it's just one. I mean, I think any attempt to name it would, in a way, kill it. But when it's just when you say, I don't want to take myself too seriously. Oh my God. I mean, some of these works just like go 6 feet into me, even the ones without the pointy, sharp. It's fabulous, Cameron. Just
Thank
brilliant
you.
work.
Thank you. No, I mean, I totally agree with the reason why I don't want to be specific is because it is about all those things, or it could not be at all. So that's why there's no need to like put words to it. Like if I was going to do that, I would have wrote it in an essay, so like I would have done that exactly, so that's why it's all at the same time. I don't want to be like, oh, this is completely about death. Oh, this is completely about my family. Oh, this is completely about home, so it has many different vertices for it to go, yeah. And I rather it's remain there, rather it be there.
Oh, it's just, I mean, it almost like flickers in front of your eyes. It's so richly layered and textured that just even while you're showing one piece, it kind of goes from one extreme to another, which I imagine would be even more so if you're in front of the work and experiencing it.
Yeah.
I just have it's kind of a technical question, but I love the baking in the oven because it's so, it's just lo-fi, you know what I mean? You can just do it, like you said, but your surfaces look so non-baked in the oven, and the finished surfaces. So how did you get that sort of metallic look?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm so sorry I did not explain that. So that form that I bake into the oven is then taken to a foundry and then cast.
I see. Okay,
That's
because I was
aluminum.
like, he baked that in the oven?
No. It's made into aluminum.
Okay.
Yeah. No, there's got to be another way in which I can
I see.
cast
Okay.
it, remove it, or do something to it.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. But then I took that then to a powder coater, and then they ended up doing it, which is like, out of all the sort of processes I've ever worked with, it's only when I work in steel, or especially in the case of like these new room piercers, or the way that I'm working now with them, is kind of the only time where I really fabricate much. Like usually there is a very much like lo-fi-ness to my work, which I wanted to keep it that way, just because I'm not resistant to, outsourcing or production or things like that. But in order for me to work the way that I'm working, want to work, in order to get closer to something, I just feel like it has to be at home. It has to be here with me. And so it makes it a little bit harder if you're only outsourcing the work itself. So like in the case of like the homegrowns, that's literally Mod Podge and a hope and a prayer that it will remain, which, actually now I've like gotten really good at making sure that it has its structure, but it's, it's only through the fact that it, that it stiffens and hardens and dries that it begins to take shape like that.
Is the performance that we saw your last performance that you've done? I mean, I know you're doing the videos, which seem related in a way, but are you not at present doing performances?
No, I mean, I did do one recently when I was in grad school, and I might do one for the upcoming show, but I mean, it's something, there's something about performance that it's a very different way of working. And so it just requires a lot of different stuff out of me. And so I just haven't gotten the opportunity to do it. And especially when I was like in grad school and then pandemic hit. And so then that kind of altered the capabilities of kind of diving into it more. So just because audience and all that other stuff became a little.
That too is an
That came weird.
extraordinarily powerful piece, the one you showed us.
Oh, thanks.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, speaking of performance and sculpture, I just wanted to say the most recent shells with the denim insulation that you've been, I sort of think of them as these beautiful, as very much related to the body containers that you were making earlier with the pleather, but that they're interesting because they're sort of like support structures to hold an alien body or a futuristic body, or they are, the way that you hung them made me also think that they are these monumental or related to Lilliputian kind of, the body as being this giant figure but still adorned somehow.
Mhm.
And so I do feel like not that you have to actually physically perform things, but I think they are very performative objects in and of themselves, and they kind of denote or evoke shells or containers for the body in really beautiful ways. And I love that I hadn't heard the story before of the fact that you had to pierce the form in order to release the energy. And so I think that's something that, of course, that the three of us were thinking about in the show in terms of what we were doing in terms of poking each other's work. But I'm a big fan of the Foley sculpture in the African section of the museum, and that sort of sense of this as being this holder of container of energy, and this odd abstract but yet figural object. I don't know, I'm blabbing now, but I do really, I mean, I think there is, even though you're not necessarily needing to perform live with the object, that they are performing. Right?
Yeah, no, I think they definitely have a choreography to them, because the way that you even install it, or I've installed them, like it just instantly makes you have to walk around them in a certain kind of way. And in the way that they're also so flat, right? So that I think is like the most trippy thing about them, because it's like you're almost like looking at an illusion where there is, if you were going this way and then somehow the body was like jutting itself out.
Yeah.
And then you're just like, okay, so then how exactly do I move my body around this thing in order to actually absorb what I'm looking at? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also like different than if you were looking at like a bronze, like bust of somebody, or a bronze, figure, because if you're walking around that, you're kind of already knowing exactly how to walk around that body. But when you're walking around something that's like an abstracted body, or an abstracted whatever a homegrown is, then that to me is a little bit more hard to capture. That's like more tough to capture, the fullness of it. So like that, I honestly feel like the choreography itself is not even necessarily being done by the form, but more done by the people, so like walking around it. Because like usually when I'm walking around them, it's like I have to either go circular, or I'm going this way, or I want to be directly behind it as means to be protected almost. Yeah, that makes me that the forms are forcing the viewer to perform somehow, or to I also love the idea, and this is a Jomi Plensa thing, right? In terms of when you at one viewpoint, you're seeing the illusion of a fully formed sculptural object, and then as soon as you or looking at the Mona Lisa, right? The idea of the eyes following you, or the idea of the form flattening and then opening up again, and that kind of this is me being way too sci-fi maybe, but that sort of sense of an orbit, right? In terms of people's movements orbiting around your central core,
of either a body, work, an object, or yourself, is a really beautiful one that you are welcoming and inviting us to kind of see you from all sides somehow. I don't know. Or there's a sense of time embedded in that sort of orbiting of this object somehow. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
No, you're going exactly where it needs to go. No, it's right there.
And then a lot of them flip from being creature body to some kind of functional object that I'm never quite sure what I would do with it, but I'm convinced there's something that could be done with it or to it, or what happens if I unzip it. And so all of these things suggest movement, action, performative motion. And I just love that slippage between creature body to something that will, I don't know, carry something, strap on the back, but I never quite know. And that's where the joy is. I never quite know.
Yeah, love it.
So I'm going to take this moment to close this out, but as I do, the exhibition at the Glass Curtain Gallery is open until February 18th. I put the link to that in the chat. Now I'm going to put some other links in the chat. So we've got Judith's talk next week. Oh, Lordy. Okay, hang on. Hey. You know, my computer never behaves when I want it to behave. There is the Eventbrite link for Judith's talk, and then Claire's talk is the week after. This talk should be available on our YouTube page in the coming weeks. And I want to kind of just talk about how splendid it was. Cameron, thank you so very much. This was really illuminating. And one of the things that I feel like your work and kind of all of the artists in the show really point to is this like knowing unknowingness and like living kind of in between. Like we have this like bodily knowledge of our own selves until one day we realize we don't. And that space, like one day we just drop something because we thought, or we trip because we knew the length of our own leg, but that moment we didn't. Right. And it's in that space that I feel like this work and this kind of push and pull, like kind of thrived within the exhibition itself. And one of the most kind of interesting things to come out of this exhibition, that I think Cameron said the other week on Bad at Sports, which everyone can look up and also go listen to that interview by this group, was that one day he had kind of made something and he was like, oh, I made a Judith Brotman. And that one of the things you guys did with the kind of passing back and forth and imbuing of each other's energy is you actually, like, the shadow of the person who started the piece or used the material to begin with was so present in the piece when the next person worked on it, that indeed it was starting to kind of co-create work that is so clearly authored by someone else. And those complications, I think, are really present within the show. I hope that made sense. Everyone nod as if it did. Because that's actually, always the way you want to end one of these when it's recorded in perpetuity. I can't thank you enough for sharing your amazing work tonight. And I also put the link to Cam's website in the chat as well. Everyone should go spend quite a bit of time there.
Yeah.
All right.
The drawings are stunning, Cam, too. I hadn't seen them with the larger group of them and the really large scale ones that are pressing against the edge of the paper are super exquisite. Yeah. Want one.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so
with
much.
that, we hope to see everyone again next week.